The rain came down in sheets against the tall windows of the Sinclair estate, each droplet catching the light from the crystal chandelier like tiny diamonds falling from heaven. Inside, Elena Vance Sinclair stood perfectly still in the marble foyer, her designer dress, the one her mother-in-law had insisted she wear to tonight's family dinner, now spattered with droplets of red wine that bloomed across the cream silk like wounds. "I want her out of this house tonight." Margaret Sinclair's voice cut through the silence, with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She stood at the top of the curved staircase, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her pearls gleaming against her black dress, looking down at Elena like a queen pronouncing sentence on a peasant who had dared enter her court. "Mother," Richard started, but his voice died in his throat when Margaret's gaze shifted to him. "Your father built this family from nothing. He didn't sacrifice everything so you could throw it away on some woman who contributed nothing, who brought nothing, who is nothing." Elena felt the words land like physical blows. After 7 years. 7 years of marriage, of biting her tongue, of trying to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold her, of loving a man who could never quite love her back the way she needed. "I have given everything to this family," Elena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. 7 years of my life. I stood by Richard through the investigation, through the scandal, through everything." "You stood by him because you had nowhere else to go," Margaret interrupted, descending the stairs with deliberate slowness. "Let's not pretend this was ever about love. You saw an opportunity and you took it. A girl from the Bronx with nothing to her name, suddenly married to a Sinclair." She laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "We all knew what you were from the beginning. The only one foolish enough to believe otherwise was my son." Elena turned to Richard, searching his face for something, anything, that would tell her he would fight for her, for them. But Richard only looked away, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Richard," she whispered, "say something." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "Elena," he finally said, still not meeting her eyes, "maybe it would be better if we took some time apart." The world tilted. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt something inside her chest crack open like ice on a frozen lake. "Time apart," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "The divorce papers are already drawn up," Margaret said, producing an envelope from seemingly nowhere. "You'll sign them tonight. You'll take nothing. You'll leave quietly and you'll never speak to anyone about this family or our business dealings. In exchange, we won't pursue legal action for the money you've spent during your marriage." "Legal action?" Elena's voice rose. "I was his wife. I had every right." "You had nothing," Margaret cut her off. "You have nothing. You are nothing. And when you walk out that door tonight, that's exactly what you'll return to. Nothing." Elena looked at the envelope in Margaret's manicured hand, then at Richard, her husband, the man she had built her entire life around, still refusing to meet her eyes. She took the envelope. "I'll need a moment to gather my things," she said, her voice suddenly calm, terrifyingly calm. "You have 1 hour," Margaret replied. "The staff will supervise." Elena climbed the stairs on legs that felt made of glass, each step an act of will. She passed Margaret without looking at her, walked down the hallway lined with portraits of Sinclair ancestors, and entered the bedroom she had shared with Richard for 7 years. She closed the door behind her and stood in the darkness for a long moment, listening to the rain. Then she began to laugh. It started as a whisper, then grew until her whole body shook with it, not the laughter of amusement, but of someone who had finally seen the truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. She walked to her jewelry box, opened the hidden compartment at the bottom, and pulled out a single piece of paper, yellowed, creased, nearly forgotten. A stock certificate. $47 million. And not a single person in this family knew it existed. 6 months earlier. Elena had never meant to become invisible. It had happened gradually the way erosion happens, so slowly you don't notice until the landscape has completely changed. She had been 23 when she met Richard Sinclair at a charity gala in Manhattan. She'd been working as a server, moving through the crowd of designer gowns and tailored suits like a ghost, invisible to everyone until she accidentally spilled champagne on his Italian leather shoes. I'm so sorry, she had stammered, dropping to her knees to wipe at his feet with her serving napkin, mortified, already calculating how much of her paycheck would go to replacing those shoes. But Richard had laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that made her look up into kind brown eyes. Please, he said, offering his hand to help her to her feet. They're just shoes. And honestly, this is the most interesting thing that's happened to me all night. He'd asked for her number. She'd assumed it was a joke, a rich man's momentary amusement. But he'd called the next day, and the day after that, and before she knew it, she was swept up in a world she had only ever seen in movies. Richard was different back then, or so she had believed. Attentive, romantic. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, her dreams, her stories of growing up in a two-bedroom apartment in the Bronx with her immigrant grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents' car accident when she was 7. You're the most real person I've ever met, Richard told her on their third date, holding her hand across a candlelit table at a restaurant where a single meal cost more than her monthly rent. Everyone in my world is so calculated. Everything is strategy and positioning. But you just say what you think. Elena had believed him. She had believed that love could bridge any gap, that his family would come to accept her, that the life she dreamed of was finally within reach. She had been so naive. The wedding was a society event, 600 guests, coverage in all the major publications, a dress designed specifically for her. But Elena remembered only fragments. The way Margaret's smile never reached her eyes during the ceremony, the whispered conversations that stopped whenever she approached, the sensation of being on display like an exotic animal in a gilded cage. They'll come around, Richard assured her on their honeymoon in Santorini. They just need time to get to know you. 7 years later, they still hadn't come around. Elena learned, slowly and painfully, that there were rules in the Sinclair world, unwritten, unspoken, but absolute. She was expected to attend certain events and avoid others, to speak when spoken to and otherwise remain decorative, to pretend not to notice when Richard came home, late smelling of another woman's perfume, to smile through Margaret's constant subtle undermining, the comments about her charming accent, the gifts of etiquette books, the pointed questions about her family history as though poverty were a genetic disease. She adapted. She learned which fork to use, how to make small talk about yacht clubs and private schools, when to laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She became a perfect Sinclair wife on the surface, while something inside her slowly dimmed. The only bright spot was her friendship with George Sinclair, Richard's uncle, a black sheep in a family of purebreds. George was 74, sharp as a tack, and permanently stationed in what the family called the West Wing of the estate, though everyone knew it was a form of exile. He had committed the unforgivable sin of caring more about art and philosophy than business, and the family had never forgiven him for it. You remind me of myself, George told her during one of their afternoon conversations, the ones that had become her only refuge. Trying to fit into a shape you were never meant to hold. At least you're a Sinclair by blood, Elena replied. I'm just an interloper. George studied her with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed facade. Blood doesn't make a family, my dear. I learned that lesson the hard way. He paused, his wrinkled hand trembling slightly as he lifted his teacup. Let me tell you a story. It was the story of George's brother, Walter Sinclair, Richard's father and the patriarch of the family until his death 3 years before Elena's wedding. The story of how Walter had built the Sinclair empire through a combination of brilliance and ruthlessness, how he had acquired companies and destroyed competitors with equal efficiency. But there was one company he never managed to acquire, George said, a strange light in his eyes. Meridian Technologies, a small tech startup in the 80s, when no one took tech seriously. The founder was a woman named Catherine Webb, brilliant, stubborn, refused to sell no matter how much Walter offered. It drove him crazy. What happened to it? George smiled. Catherine died in 1991. Car accident, very tragic. She left everything to her son, but he had no interest in business. Sold everything off except. He paused dramatically. Except 10,000 shares of stock. Worthless at the time. But she'd made him promise never to sell them, so he didn't. Just put them in a safety deposit box and forgot about them. What happened to the son? He died too. Cancer, about 15 years ago. He'd never married, never had children, never told anyone about the shares. George leaned forward conspiratorially. But here's where it gets interesting. Meridian Technologies was eventually acquired by another company, which was acquired by another, which was acquired by another, a whole chain of acquisitions over decades. Do you know what company sits at the end of that chain? Elena shook her head. Quantum Dynamics, George whispered. Currently trading at $4,700 a share. Elena's breath caught. The 10,000 shares would be worth approximately $47 million today, accounting for splits and dividends reinvested. George settled back in his chair with a satisfied expression. But that's just the financial value. The real value is symbolic. Catherine Webb held Meridian as a private company. When she died, the corporate structure got tangled in probate for years before the first acquisition. During that time, the company issued emergency shares to stay solvent. Those original 10,000 shares? They come with a special provision written into the original charter. Voting rights. Significant voting rights. Uncle George, Elena said slowly, why are you telling me this? George reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, a stock certificate, creased and worn. Because Catherine Webb was my mother's cousin. When her son died, the shares should have reverted to my mother's line. But Walter intercepted them, buried them, pretended they didn't exist. He held out the certificate. I found them 2 years ago, going through Walter's personal papers after Margaret thought she destroyed everything incriminating. I've been waiting for the right moment and the right person. I can't accept this, Elena said, even as her fingers itched to take the paper. This belongs to you. I'm 74 years old, my dear. I have no children, no spouse, no interest in money or power. But you, his eyes softened. You deserve a way out. A real one. Not whatever scraps they'll throw you when they finally decide you're no longer useful. They could decide that tomorrow. They could decide it tonight. George pressed the certificate into her hands. Take it. Hide it. And when the time comes, and it will come, use it. Elena had hidden the certificate in her jewelry box, in a compartment even Richard didn't know about. For 6 months, she had carried the knowledge like a secret talisman, a parachute she hoped she would never need. She had needed it sooner than she expected. The night of her expulsion, Elena sat in a motel room on the outskirts of the city, watching the rain streak down the window and clutching the stock certificate like a lifeline. She had signed the divorce papers, or rather, she had signed the ones Margaret thought were the divorce papers. What Margaret didn't know was that Elena had switched them in her room, replacing the originals with modified copies she had prepared months ago on George's advice. The documents she'd signed gave her nothing from the Sinclair estate, true. But they also contained no non-disclosure agreements, no non-compete clauses, no restrictions on her future activities. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The next morning, she made 3 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer named David Chin, whose name George had given her with the instruction, he's not part of their network. He can be trusted. The second was to a woman named Rebecca Shaw, a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate investigations. The third was to a number she had memorized but never dialed, a reporter at the Financial Times who had been investigating quantum dynamics for years without getting anywhere. My name is Elena Vance, she said when he answered. I have something you might be interested in. 3 months later, the offices of Chen and Associates occupied the top floor of a brownstone in Brooklyn, far from the gleaming towers of Manhattan where the Sinclairs did their business. Elena sat in the conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents and a team of people who had become, over the past 12 weeks, something like a family. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, David Chin said, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. The original stock certificate gives you not just $47 million in equity, but also a seat on the Quantum Dynamics board and voting rights equivalent to 15% of all outstanding shares. That's correct. And the Sinclair family currently controls quantum dynamics through a web of shell companies and trusts, holding approximately 40% of shares. Also correct. David shook his head slowly. Elena, do you understand what this means? You could walk into their next board meeting and single-handedly block any major decision they want to make. I understand. Rebecca Shaw looked up from her laptop, her expression troubled. There's more. The financial analysis I've done over the past 3 months. Elena, the Sinclairs haven't just been controlling quantum dynamics. They've been systematically looting it. Hidden transactions, offshore accounts, fake consulting contracts. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars siphoned out over the past decade. Can you prove it? With the access your board seat gives you to internal records?
Yes.
I can prove it. Elena thought about George, alone in his wing of the Sinclair estate. She thought about Catherine Webb, who had refused to sell her company even when Walter Sinclair had done everything in his power to force her. She thought about all the invisible women, the forgotten ones, the ones who had been pushed aside and written off. Then let's prove it, she said. The next 6 months were a masterclass in patience. Elena didn't immediately claim her board seat. Instead, she moved carefully, strategically, building her position piece by piece. She used her shares as collateral to secure funding for a new investment firm, Vance Capital, which she quietly staffed with people who had been burned by the Sinclairs over the years. Former employees who had been wrongfully terminated, business partners who had been cheated, journalists who had been silenced. She rented an apartment in Manhattan, nothing flashy, just a comfortable 2-bedroom with a view of Central Park. She bought clothes that fit her instead of the designer pieces Margaret had always insisted on. She cut her hair, started running in the mornings, remembered what it felt like to occupy her own body instead of performing a role. And she watched, waited, gathered evidence. The Sinclairs, for their part, had apparently forgotten she existed. Richard had already moved on to a new girlfriend, a 25-year-old model whose Instagram was full of photos from their yacht trips. Margaret was photographed at charity galas, dispensing wisdom about family values and the importance of legacy. The family's public image remained untarnished. But behind the scenes, things were starting to crumble. Rebecca's forensic analysis had revealed something unexpected. The Sinclair family was in financial trouble. Their aggressive acquisition strategy had left them overextended, and several of their major investments had turned sour. They were secretly selling off assets, desperately trying to maintain the appearance of wealth while the foundation eroded beneath them. They need a win, David told Elena during one of their strategy sessions. Something big to shore up their position. And, according to my sources, they've found one. A merger with Meridian Systems. Meridian Systems? Elena frowned. That name. It's no coincidence. The company was founded by a former Meridian Technologies executive who bought the name when the original company was acquired. It's now a major player in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The merger would give Quantum Dynamics access to critical patents and technology. It would also make the Sinclairs one of the most powerful families in tech. When's the vote? 6 weeks from now. At the annual shareholder meeting. Elena smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Perfect. The Quantum Dynamics annual shareholder meeting was held at the Waldorf Astoria, in a ballroom that could have held a small army. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables set with white linens and gold-rimmed china. The air smelled of expensive perfume and barely concealed ambition. Elena arrived alone, wearing a red dress that had cost more than her first apartment's entire annual rent. The color was deliberate, bold, impossible to ignore. A statement. She felt the ripple of recognition move through the room as she entered. Whispers followed her like shadows. Isn't that? I thought she was. What is she doing here? Elena walked through the crowd with her head held high, making eye contact with no one, heading straight for the front of the room where the board members were gathering. Elena.
She stopped, turned.
Richard stood behind her, looking older than she remembered. There were new lines around his eyes, a grayness to his skin that spoke of sleepless nights. His new girlfriend was nowhere to be seen. Richard, she replied evenly. You look terrible. What are you doing here? How did you even get in? I'm a shareholder. She held up her badge, the same badge every board member wore, but with her name printed in bold letters. Didn't anyone tell you? I have a seat at the table now. Richard's face went pale. That's impossible. We made sure. You made sure I left with nothing from the divorce. And I did. But this? She tapped the badge. This was never yours to take. Elena. Excuse me, she said, stepping past him. I believe the meeting is about to begin. The confrontation, when it came, was not the explosive showdown Elena had once imagined.
It was quieter than that.
More devastating. Margaret Sinclair presided over the meeting from the head of the long conference table, flanked by lawyers and executives. She didn't acknowledge Elena's presence as she took her seat among the board members, but the tightening of her jaw betrayed her awareness. The meeting proceeded through the usual formalities: financial reports, executive compensation, committee appointments. Elena voted with a majority on every issue, giving nothing away. Then came the Meridian Systems merger. Before we proceed to the vote, the chairman announced, "The floor is open for discussion." Elena raised her hand. The room went silent. "The chair recognizes Ms. Vance," the chairman said, his voice carefully neutral. Elena stood. She could feel every eye in the room on her: the board members, the executives, the lawyers, the observers. Richard sitting in the gallery. Margaret, gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some concerns about this merger that I'd like to raise before we proceed." She pressed a button on her phone, and the screens around the room flickered to life, displaying the first of Rebecca's forensic reports. What you're looking at is a summary of financial irregularities within quantum dynamics over the past decade. Unauthorized transfers totaling approximately $240 million. Payments to shell companies with no legitimate business purpose. Stock manipulation designed to artificially inflate the company's value before major announcements. The murmuring started low and grew louder. "This is outrageous," Margaret interrupted. "These accusations are baseless." "They're documented," Elena replied calmly. "Every transaction traced, every recipient identified, every dollar accounted for. The full report has been submitted to the SEC, the FBI, and 3 major financial publications, who are prepared to run the story tomorrow morning." "You can't prove." "I can prove that the Sinclair family has been systematically defrauding this company and its shareholders for years. I can prove that this merger isn't about growth or innovation. It's about covering up the damage and using Meridian Systems assets to plug the holes you've created." Elena advanced the presentation to the next slide, a diagram showing the flow of money from quantum dynamics through a labyrinth of offshore accounts, all leading back to entities controlled by the Sinclair family. "I can prove," she continued, her voice rising, "that while you were calling me nothing, while you were throwing me out of your home in the rain, while you were telling me I contributed nothing and deserved nothing, I was the only person in this room who cared enough about this company to actually protect it." She turned to face Margaret directly. "You wanted to know what I contributed? Here it is. I'm contributing the truth." The vote was unanimous. The merger was tabled pending investigation. Emergency motions were filed. Lawyers swarmed. Within hours, the Sinclair family's carefully constructed empire had begun to collapse. Elena was outside the ballroom, finally allowing herself to breathe, when she heard footsteps behind her. "How did you do it?" She turned. Richard stood in the hallway, his face ashen, his hands trembling. "Do what?" "All of it. The shares, the investigation, the timing. How did you know?" Elena considered the question. She thought about George, who had seen her when no one else did. About Catherine Webb, who had refused to surrender even when the world told her she should. About her grandmother, who had raised her to believe that invisible didn't mean worthless. "You taught me," she finally said. "You and your mother. Every time you made me feel small, every time you reminded me that I didn't belong, you were teaching me to watch, to listen, to wait." She paused. "I learned from the best." "Elena, don't." She held up her hand. "Don't apologize. Don't explain. Don't try to make this into something it isn't. You made a choice 7 years ago to marry me, and then you spent every day after that choosing everyone else over me. That's who you are. And this." She gestured toward the ballroom, where chaos still reigned. "This is who I am." She started to walk away, then stopped. "Your Uncle George passed away last month. Did you know that? Did anyone in your family even notice?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "He left me everything," Elena continued. "Not that he had much, just some books, some letters, his collection of vintage cameras. But there was one thing he wanted me to tell you specifically. He said, 'Tell Richard that I forgive him for becoming his father, and that I hope someday he learns to forgive himself.'" She left Richard standing in the hallway, his expression crumbling, and walked out into the evening air. The city was alive around her. Honking taxis, chattering pedestrians, the eternal hum of New York that had been her first lullaby and her constant companion. She had nothing to prove anymore. No one to perform for. No role to play except the one she chose for herself. Elena Vance hailed a taxi, climbed inside, and gave the driver her address. Home. For the first time in 7 years, she was going home. 1 year later, the Vance Foundation occupied the top 3 floors of a renovated factory building in the Bronx, the same neighborhood where Elena had grown up, where her grandmother had raised her on stories of the old country and dreams of a better future. The foundation had 3 missions: supporting first-generation college students from low-income backgrounds, providing legal aid to women in abusive marriages, and funding investigative journalism that exposed corporate corruption. In its first year of operation, it had distributed $17 million in grants and changed countless lives. Elena stood at her office window, watching the sun set over the city she had learned to love all over again. Behind her, the walls were decorated with photographs, not of galas and celebrity events, but of students at graduation ceremonies, of families reunited, of reporters accepting awards for stories that had begun with Vance Foundation support. There was a knock at her door. "Come in." David Chen entered, carrying a tablet. "The final reports from the SEC investigation just came in. I thought you'd want to see them." Elena took the tablet, scrolling through the summary. The Sinclair family had been found liable for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Margaret was facing criminal charges. Richard had pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against his mother. The family's assets had been frozen pending civil litigation from defrauded shareholders. "It's over," David said quietly. "Is it?" Elena set down the tablet. "Margaret's lawyers will appeal. Richard will probably get a suspended sentence. In 5 years, they'll have rebuilt somehow. People like them always do. Maybe. But they'll never forget." David paused. "And neither will anyone who reads the story." Elena nodded slowly. "That's all I ever wanted, really. Not revenge. Not even justice. Just to be remembered. To matter. You matter." She smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. "I'm starting to believe that." That evening, Elena visited George's grave in a small cemetery outside the city. It was a quiet place, shaded by old oaks, far from the Sinclair family mausoleum where generations of the family were interred in marble splendor. "I did it," she told him, kneeling to place flowers on the simple headstone. "Everything you wanted. Everything you believed I could do. I'm just sorry you weren't there to see it." The wind rustled through the leaves, and for a moment, Elena could almost hear George's voice. "I saw it, my dear. I always saw it." She stayed until the stars came out, then drove back to the city, to her apartment with its view of Central Park, to the life she had built from nothing. The next morning, she had a breakfast meeting with a young woman named Sarah, 23, from the projects in Queens, a first-generation college graduate now working as a junior analyst at a major investment firm. Sarah reminded Elena of herself, all those years ago. Hungry, uncertain, desperate to prove she belonged. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said over coffee. "Of course." "How did you do it? How did you go from where you started to where you are now?" Elena considered the question. She thought about all the easy answers she could give. Work hard, believe in yourself, never give up. All true, all insufficient. I stopped trying to become someone else, she finally said. For years, I thought I had to transform myself, to become the kind of person who belonged in those rooms, at those tables. But I never did. I was always the girl from the Bronx trying to play a part. She set down her coffee cup. The turning point wasn't when I got power or money or influence. It was when I realized that who I already was, everything I had survived, everything I had learned, everything I had become, was exactly what I needed. I just had to stop being ashamed of it. Sarah nodded slowly. That sounds really hard. It is. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Elena reached across the table and took the young woman's hand. But I promise you, it's worth it. You're worth it. Every single thing that makes you different, that makes you uncomfortable, that makes you feel like you don't belong, that's your strength. They'll try to convince you it's weakness. They'll try to make you invisible. Don't let them. What if I fail? Then you fail.
And you learn.
And you try again. Elena smiled. Do you know what the Sinclair family taught me? That power isn't something you're given. It's something you take. Not through force or manipulation, but through refusing to be diminished. Through knowing your own value even when everyone around you tells you you're worthless. Through playing a long game when everyone expects you to give up. She released Sarah's hand and sat back in her chair. You want to know the secret? There isn't one. There's just you, making choices every day. Choosing to show up. Choosing to believe in yourself when no one else does. Choosing to wait for the right moment instead of reacting to every insult and injury. She paused. And sometimes, choosing to walk away from everything you thought you wanted in order to find what you actually need. 5 years later, the Vance Foundation was named one of the most effective philanthropic organizations in the country. Elena had expanded its mission to include international programs, supporting women entrepreneurs in developing countries and funding education initiatives across 3 continents. She had also fallen in love, unexpectedly, beautifully, with a documentary filmmaker named James who had first approached her for a project about corporate whistleblowers. Their wedding was small, held in the garden of a boutique hotel in upstate New York, attended by friends who had become family. Richard Sinclair had served 6 months of house arrest and now lived quietly in Connecticut, far from the spotlight he had once courted. The last Elena heard, he was trying to write a book about his experiences, a redemption narrative that no publisher seemed interested in buying. Margaret Sinclair had died in prison, still maintaining her innocence, still refusing to acknowledge that she had ever done anything wrong. Her obituary in the Times had been carefully neutral, but the comment section had been illuminating. The Sinclair estate had been sold at auction, its contents scattered to the winds. Elena had attended, anonymously, and purchased a single item, a small watercolor painting that George had kept in his room, a sunset over a harbor painted by his mother when she was a young woman. It hung now in Elena's office, next to a photograph of her grandmother, next to the stock certificate that had started everything, framed behind glass, a reminder of how far she had come. Sometimes, late at night, Elena would stand at her window and look out at the city lights, and she would think about all the invisible women out there, working, struggling, waiting for their moment. She would think about the weight of invisible things, the small cruelties that accumulate like snow, the quiet strengths that go unnoticed, the fortunes hidden in plain sight. And she would smile, because she knew what they were yet to discover. That invisibility was not weakness. It was camouflage. That silence was not surrender. It was strategy. That nothing, not money, not family, not fear, could diminish the worth of a human soul that refused to be diminished. The rain began to fall, soft and gentle against the window, and Elena watched it trace patterns on the glass, patterns that looked, if you tilted your head just right, like tiny diamonds falling from heaven. She turned off the light and went to join her husband, leaving the city to glitter and dream without her. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more battles to fight, more invisible women to find and lift up and remind of their own incalculable worth. But tonight, Elena Vance simply was. And that was enough. That was everything.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.